Hello, welcome to Cherry Beckert's GovCon podcast, where we discuss current government contracting trends, compliance matters, and best practices to guide federal contractors forward. My name is Eric Poppy. I'm a managing director with Cherry Beckert's team, government contract consulting team, and with me today is Todd, a director in our government contracting practice. Todd has over 20 years of experience in operations, working at government contractors, large and small. So Todd, thanks for joining me today.
Happy to be here, Art. Thanks for asking.
Do you want to give a quick, this is your first podcast, do you want to give a quick background on yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I've been in the government contracting space for over 20 years. I started out in compliance, regulatory compliance. I was in corporate accounting. I've done forward pricing rates, disclosure statements, incurred cost submissions, and then I moved into P&L line management, and I've been in operations for well over 15 years of my career. So I was at Northrop Grumman and Task for 17, and I was at a small company for about 6 years before I came to Cherry Beckert 2 years ago.
That is awesome. Tons of experience for this topic. I know you and I, when just talking about current clients and prospects and some of the current engagements that we have going on, have hit on this topic a few times already. So I'm pumped that you'll be joining, that you're joining for this podcast today. So today we're talking about budgeting and forecasting for government contractors. You know, we're getting close to year end, very close to the holiday season. Right now, for tons of companies, you either started your budgeting process for FY24 already, or you are in the midst of it and you're going through the approval process. So our thoughts were, let's have a podcast, discuss some, major items to consider when thinking about the budgeting process, things to consider that are important for government contractors that might be more unique to GovCons versus other industries. So very excited for us to jump in on that. So with that, Todd, what should GovCons be considering during year end and moving into the next calendar year with this process?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a now thing. The larger the contractor, the earlier the process starts. I think for some of the smaller contractors, they may just be embarking on the process, but it's definitely a look back at what you've done this past year so far. So you want to look at year-to-date performance. What are some of the trends that you've seen? What are some of the things that have gone well? What are some of the areas that need improvement? So you know what those things are and kind of get a good status and barometer of where you're at currently. And then it's how do you leverage that information as you launch into the next year's budgeting process? And it's a lot of things. It's depending on a lot of things: contract types, where you are in the contract life cycles, what's coming up in the future that you know about relative to pipeline, recompetes, all those things come into play here. So
we're really looking at, historical, how we've done month to week, or really month to month, quarter to quarter, till we're at now. Mm-hmm. Current considerations of where we're at year to date, those last few month variants, and then now we're getting into our future state in that forecast aspect. So, let's talk top line to bottom line through reviewing the operating plan, including indirect rates, which I feel like a lot of times clients and prospects that we're working with, they're really, a lot of times I feel like they're just like, oh, I need my provisional rates for the next contract year, especially if you're an emerging small business of sorts. But let's talk through top line to bottom line, some high level considerations used to construct the budget. Do you want to start us off with revenue?
Yeah, I would. I just back up for just 1 second on Eric. Is like, I think taking the top line, bottom line approach and looking at the entire operating plan, I think is really kind of the best way to start the process. I mean, lots of people look just at revenue, right? I'm just going to do an annual operating plan. I'm just going to look at revenue and profitability, but there's a lot more to it. And we'll walk through all those pieces. I think it's really important. But from a revenue perspective, I mean, we want to look at, what's been the flavor of the revenue generated so far, right? What relative to line of business, customer, contract type, and looking at all those different, how are we performing relative to those different metrics, right? So then within that, it's taking a look at the variances that we've encountered along the way in the current year's performance, where we run into variance and doing some real good variance analysis. So we can employ some root cause analysis techniques to kind of figure out what's going on and how do we course correct if there's course corrections necessary. And that's really kind of contract dependent. If we're burning cool on a T&M, what do we need to do to get it back on track? Where are we relative to deliverables and milestones on fixed price? Where are we relative to ceiling on cost type? Those are some of the things we want to be looking at here. And relatively, and overall, where are we in the life cycle? If it's a 5-year contract, are we in option year 1? So it's kind of business as usual, or is it not? But understanding those base programs and how to project the revenue for those for the next year is really key based on prior performance.
Well, and then with that, that really drives direct labor and hits the staffing considerations for next year. You can start looking at, maybe your LCAP mix and some of your current staff alignment. Are you trying to, with some of your objectives, trying to maybe go, do you have a lot of people that are retiring? Are you trying to go greener? What are those labor mixes? Where are you recruiting from? All those elements that play into it. Salary, competitiveness, and just how do you stay, I feel like this is actually one of the huge issues that we talk with clients about, like what's one of your biggest pain points, and that's, well, staying competitive and attracting and retaining big talent. So being competitive with those salaries, escalations, and what can you escalate to from a labor perspective? And that can be on a contract by contract basis of what can you really withstand? Because if one contract you're kind of at capped out, well, that's going to bleed into overall profitability because you have to make up that escalation, stay competitive some way. And then, growing the more junior folks and training them up to, and potentially maybe make up some of that loss in margin there too.
Right. Well, this is an opportunity to engage in real analysis of the staff, Eric, relative to the qualifications for the labor categories, right?
Good point. Yep.
Am I staffed correctly, and do I need to graduate some folks? So that's where, if your escalation is 3% and you want to give out merit increases in excess of 3%, there could be opportunity for graduating folks within labor categories. It's a key area to look at. So I think another thing here, Eric, is taking a look at we're looking at the direct labor and now you start looking at expenses, fringe expenses, relative to supporting the staff. So do we really we want to look at, let's go with a key consideration is looking at, is the benefit structure sufficient to really attract and retain the people that you want? And that's challenging in today's environment. So taking a look at that's really important. Looking at whether the health benefits that you currently offer are competitive, and are you leveraging the size of your corporation and negotiating appropriately or effectively? And then I guess if you're looking at the whole fringe pool holistically and you're looking at attracting and retaining talent, are you offering competitive time off policies? Are you relative to 401? How are you relative to 401k and 401k match? And then
just to jump right in here, that healthcare piece, it's always the wild card every year. How much is that going to fluctuate? How much is that going to go up? Really, I feel like it's just been going up, up, up recently. And then I feel like a lot of companies, when they're talking about competitiveness, they're going, hey, I need to attract more talent. I'm kind of capped from a salary standpoint at a certain level, because it might be sometimes even government dictated of years of experience, this ERI report, this labor category, whatever it is. So how do I then bring it in? That benefits is kind of the lever that they use. And to have line of sight into how is that tracked historically from a budgeting standpoint, and going all the way across, and how much carry forward you might have of certain benefits of PTO or sick or things, and how does that track? What are the escalations that play in there? And depending on the contract type and how your margins are, that's an area that definitely could be used to kind of attract good talent. I know we're kind of going down a rabbit hole here for a second, but it's just something that popped in my head.
Well, it's kind of the flavor of the talent you're trying to attract. True. It could be that, on that particular contract, the folks that you're trying to hire are of a certain, whatever it is, demographic, let's say, and they're more interested in PTO than they are 401k, or vice versa. It depends on what you're looking for.
Yep.
But it's dependent upon your contract type and the type of talent that you're trying to recruit or retain.
That's a very good point. And then, so from an overhead perspective, that kind of drives, we went through revenue, direct labor, fringe. From an overhead standpoint, it's really, are you managing effectively the project staff and project profitability? And do you have the infrastructure as part of that overhead pool to help support your current base of labor and which drives, of course, the revenue piece and any new work that's going to be coming in? So are your recruiting programs up to snub? Are you managing your talent correctly? Do you have to have any type of security aspects that feed into that pool? So a little bit more of, I feel like a lot of times overhead isn't, you can kind of predict a lot of those variables from an expense standpoint, because usually it's all driven from the denominator. But yeah, that's the next piece to consider.
Well, it's interesting there too. It's kind of this, it's similar to Fringe in that, the type of people that you have working on your projects, and what it costs to manage them, right? And if you're talking about kind of a coaching and mentoring of your junior staff and bringing them up through the ranks, this is where you spend your money on training.
Yep.
Okay. That's where you start to budget for those types of things. So you got to be thinking about that relative. And then also, Eric, what comes in here is this, the notion of customer satisfaction and, some of the scoring mechanisms that customers use, which will tell you where you need to spend your money, right? If they're concerned about your talent, then you got to work on your talent. If they're concerned about your ability to consistently staff, right? I mean, they will tell you basically what they are seeing and invariably tell you what you need to work on.
It's a very good point. Very good point. Then lastly, from a indirect rate standpoint, G&A, from a G&A perspective, when we're talking about budgets, when you're talking about the government, when you're talking about, potential provisional rates and forward rates, I feel like it's the rate that tries to get chopped the most, to get to the bottom. But really there, you're analyzing the effectiveness of C-suite relative to the goals. You're looking at all the back office items that come in, even if it's home office allocations too, but finance, accounting, legal, other operations, IT might be one of those levers that you can kind of move. Measuring indirect rate performance is a huge one. I think in kind of going back a second of doing that consistently on a monthly basis, and then looking at it from a quarter standpoint, then looking at it from a contract standpoint, or future projections really can help from that, looking at it from a program standpoint of how are you managing the rates to the program. You kind of mentioned this when talking about overhead, but what are your goals and objectives, the business development piece, and do you need to double down kind of on B&P costs? All things to consider there. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was actually, while you were sharing, I was thinking about proposal development. And, a lot of times in the cost narrative, they're going to ask you for a 5-year trend of your indirects.
Yeah, good point.
So being realistic here in these indirect rates is really important as you project, right? I've consistently run my G&A at 13%, okay? But I want to, in my forward pricing, build a rate that's 11% or 10%. Okay, then you have to start explaining in your narrative how you're going to get from your run rate, which has been the past 4 years of 13, to something like 10 or 11. So I think being realistic here is really important about your indirect rates.
Well, in that, go into the narrative, if you're a company that's thinking about changing your indirect rate structure as well, and now for your forecasts based off your historicals and now your budget, and then you then might even have to talk about how that change didn't really impact, or how it was positive or negative effect on your rate, and why that might be okay for project or for costing X project. So there's that aspect too. So yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Eric, everything we've talked about up until now really leads to the bottom line, right? So if you've done all of the necessary activities, you're tracking, you're monitoring, you're course correcting, you're trying to optimize your cost spend, maximize your top line, maximize your profitability. Really, at the end of the day, this should just be fallout of proper operations. So how are you effectively managing your bottom line? And it's about process here, I think. Regular, deliberate, intentional reviews, engaging with the teams that can impact the results, implementing the course corrections and tracking the initiatives.
In short, having a true budgeting process that's documented, reviewed, sent up the chain, and getting all those key inputs from the different divisions, departments, cost centers, whatever you want to call it, all kind of, all kind of the same thing when talking generally, but getting those key things from the different people. So, let's take a moment and just talk about what are some of those key drivers when it comes to putting together the budget. Todd, do you mind just taking a quick second and talk about some key areas that clients or companies should be looking at when they're planning their budgets?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're looking forward, we've kind of already talked about kind of base programs. We kind of know what our current execution looks like. It's really starting to look at, do we have stretch targets for our team? Are we looking for on-contract growth? We're trying to stretch the team. Are we trying to increase the footprint? Whatever we're trying to do with the current client base, as well as what's going on with our recompetes. If we have recompetes, what's the recompete status, and what's the new business look like? So the next biggest consideration comes in that form of what are the recompetes, where am I in project life cycles, and what's my pipeline look like, and how mature and robust is the pipeline? That's the next biggest considerations.
And on that pipeline piece, considering potentially what are those brand new opportunities that are coming in? What's my P-win? Agencies, do I have a foot in the door at that agency? Do I not? I feel like right now, kind of the trend in the industry is large contract vehicles, GWACs, IDIQs, and like what will you actually, like how many companies are being awarded that? How many task orders will you be potentially going at through that? So you have to get through, first win the IDIQ or the GWAC, and then you're competing against a task order. So all of that should be in consideration with that new work.
Yes. I mean, technically you're opening up a whole new set of things to talk about when it comes to IDIQs and GWACs and how effectively will people actually utilize them. So, you have to really engage in a thorough cost benefit analysis of those vehicles. How many times have I seen people win or companies win an IDIQ only to drive very little to no work through it?
That's a lot of resources.
That's the next podcast.
Yeah, that is definitely that will take a few minutes to go through. So from a resource standpoint, it's kind of the infrastructure that's available versus what you need to support that new growth. IT, recruiting, talent, kind of the things we hit on before, G&A and overhead, business development. What new items do you need to support that growth that you're potentially projecting?
I think it depends, Eric. We talked about it already, I think, at least a little bit, is where is the pipeline relative to, I guess, maybe maturity, right? If the majority of the opportunities are still in the quantify phase, then the resources that we're going to need are going to be far different from if our opportunities are in the pre-RFP, RFP phase, where we'll be spending money on proposal development versus money on business development and growth orientation. And then when you get to RFP to post-submittal, now we're talking about aggressively, if we haven't already, recruiting, right? Because that's the hardest thing. And depending on the nature of your contracts, if you've got cleared contracts, you need cleared resources. Those are really hard to find. Where are you located geographically? Are the resources even available? Are you able to work remotely? Do people have to be on site in a skiff? There's all these considerations that come into play. So recruiting, honestly, 9 times out of 10, recruiting has been the long pole for a lot of the contracts that I've seen. And with the contract stipulations of you have to be fully staffed within the first, 30 days or even less. With key personnel, it's usually the first week. How are you going to make sure you can get there, especially when it's new work? So lots of considerations here when it comes to that from a resourcing perspective.
Very good point. And I know we're getting close to time now, but I do want to hit on one more thing before we close out this podcast today. We've talked through the budgets and the key drivers, and for companies that are looking to grow, what do they need to be doing, and what's kind of the overarching objective of going through this process?
Yeah, I think this is what they call, let's go with the process needs to be deliberate and intentional. And The results need to be measurable, but this is the annual operating plan, in my opinion, right? Putting together a good solid revenue projection, an associated direct labor projection, profitability, and as a side effect of some of this new business stuff, you can also forecast out some gross bookings, so you can look at your backlogs, right? You want to look at gross and funded backlog here. So that's that process, that annual operating plan process. And as a part of that is the forward pricing or provisional billing rate development, right? Because that's the rest of your operating plan. Is how are you projecting your rates? How are you projecting your spend? And then you have these baseline plans in place across all these different elements that you can track and measure against all year long. And you'll know when you'll understand your variances. You'll do some root cause analysis. You'll know what course corrections are needed to get back on track. That's the benefit of this very deliberate and intentional planning process.
Yeah, and you understand, you'll be able to identify where you might have immature processes or potential weaknesses to refine, and really be able to have good insight into your current state and future state of your financials. So with that, Todd, thank you very much for joining me today on Cherry Bekaert's GovCon podcast. Here at CB, we do have several professionals with years of operational and contractual experience when it comes to going through the budgeting and forecasting process. So please feel free to reach out to Cherry Bekaert. We're happy to be a resource for you and your team. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. Please make sure to follow Cherry Bekaert wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to tune in for our additional podcast series on government contracting topics, including currently going on cost accounting standards and business systems, and appreciate the time. Thank you.